Welcome to the Community Living Education Project's Sharing Possibilities for Community Connections Learning event. The Community Living Education Project, also known as CLEP, is a program through Rutgers School of Public Health. CLEP is committed to providing individual guidance, mentoring, and education regarding community living resources for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities living in the state of New Jersey. The CLEP team, many who are family members themselves, can serve as a bridge for families whose loved ones may be seeking residential supports outside of the family's home. Today's webinar, Strategies for Limiting Exposure to Sexual Abuse and Decreasing Inappropriate Sexual Behaviors for People with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, is being presented by Dr. Bobby Gallagher. To ensure the highest sound quality possible, all attendees will be muted during today's event. To interact with the host or presenter, please use your Q&A option on the bottom of your screen. Topic-specific questions will be addressed as long as time allows. Please, for all's consideration, we're going to ask that everyone keep their questions as general as possible. At this time, I would like to welcome today's presenter, Dr. Bobby Gallagher. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Melanie, for that. So let me just get right into it, since we have a short period of time for a really complex topic, right, that we want to kind of talk about today. Just to give you a little background on myself, I am also the parent of two individuals with autism. I'm the parent of three, two with autism, and they are soon to be 29 and 30 years old. So, and I have both a boy and a girl, and that brings a little bit of a difference to this topic when we're talking about sexuality and what we need to do to prep individuals, and just some of the information about what we have out there that's available to us and how that may differ depending. So let's get right into it and kind of talk about some of the challenges I think that many of you, if you're here today, are probably facing. And that is, if you have a loved one with a developmental disability or an intellectual disability, you are probably worried about them, and worried about them for a variety of reasons. But one of the biggest challenges we have is, even just society-wise or culturally, we have sort of all accepted the fact that individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities are sexual beings, and that they have the right to a sexual life, and the best that we can possibly provide to them, or not that they are allowed to have or permitted to have. But the challenge that we have is that we've done little to help with this since 1977, as far as education goes, when our children were in school programs, of anybody really doing anything to change that information that's presented to them, even though our ideology may have changed. So and what I mean by this too is, if you've had a child in your life who required intensive services in order to learn how to be toilet trained, or how to learn their ABCs, if it wasn't something that came very easily to them, it would be very hard to imagine that if they needed that amount of assistance to facilitate other areas of their life, that they wouldn't also need it for their sexual life as well, just some of that basic needs and support. And for individuals who maybe didn't need things that were that intensive, but were really seeing struggle in that area of social interactions, for us to assume that this area of sexuality can just be sort of naturally developed is naive on our part, as far as that goes. And sometimes maybe a way to kind of get out of talking about the subject, and in that it's just natural, right, for people to know what to do or how to engage in sexual activity. So where would someone, if their path is to meet a partner and to be with somebody, where would someone with an intellectual and developmental disability even meet that partner? And how could we help to facilitate that if need be? Now I think we're very fortunate that we have Uber and some other things where maybe somebody could go out on a date and take an Uber, as opposed to asking mom to take them and they're 35 years old, right? But the other challenge too for many of our individuals is the level of supervised social events and the chaperones that are there, that they're typically developing peers never experience. And I understand why, right? So as a mom, I'm probably equally as overprotective of my children as all of you are. And then as a professional, I understand that we need to be able to sort of give some guidance and see what they can experience, and kind of trying to balance both of those is a really hard thing to do. So why? Why is it so hard? Well, first of all, we often think of individuals with IDD as being innocent and not really caring about sex or wanting sex or thought of as being asexual. And I blame Big Bang Theory and some of these other TV shows that show our individuals as not desiring sex and even in some ways being off put by it. And so that has really perpetuated a myth about individuals not wanting to have relationships or wanting to be sexually active. We, of course, often think of them as victims, that if they are exposed to anything sexual, that it has been abuse in some way. And then we're afraid that if we talk about it, that's exactly what made them think about it. And so I will ask you all, was it really the word sex, that kind of made you interested in sex? I don't think so. And what we do know is that if we can help them to understand about sexuality, the more they know, the more likely they will be to not be exposed to abuse. And so it's actually the opposite, I think, of what many people think. And that really kind of just makes sense if you think about it. If you never tell somebody about something and then they're exposed to it by someone who's not looking out in their best interests, they may go along with it, especially for many of our individuals who have been in special needs programs all of their lives. There's a lot about compliance. There's a lot about listening to their teachers and following instructions as they get older and they're exposed to other adults who may be acting as that teacher role, but without good intentions. They may comply with things that they shouldn't. Right. So the consequence for not addressing any of this, in addition to certainly helping our individuals to avoid sexual abuse, but also the issue around inappropriate sexual behaviors, which usually stems again from lack of education, is that it will not only limit their involvement in their community, but it could also lead to incarceration. And um, we know that individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities have been incarcerated due to inappropriate sexual behavior. But what we don't know is how much education did they receive prior to that about what the rules are, right? What are the rules of consent? What are the rules around appropriate behavior in public? And so we really have to be sure that we are stressing the education of someone prior to them possibly engaging in these behaviors. So where does it all begin, right? Where does it all start? Just like, typically developing or neurotypical individuals, we usually start with something as simple as teaching body parts. And I highly encourage parents to use appropriate names when teaching body parts, especially when our children eventually have to talk to doctors or talk to others about their bodies so that they know what the names of their bodies parts are. And then for some of our children who have opportunities to be in more inclusive settings, we should probably also be teaching them some of these slang words. And the reason that I say that is because some of our children who are really, desiring friendships may be exposed to people who are not going to be kind to them and either calling them such names or provoking them to call others these things where they might get into trouble. And that's what we've seen. So we have seen where some of the individuals that I've worked with were encouraged to say things to someone that were highly inappropriate, not knowing that they were inappropriate. And of course then they're the ones that get in trouble, not the person that encouraged them, right? Because they're in this environment where they're supposed to know what all these very strange rules are that we have. So it's really important to teach some of those slangs, what they may mean, and whether or not they're appropriate to be used. So I know that most of you, if not all of you, your children are now over the age of 21, but I think maybe you could let me know, in a chat or in there, and let us kind of get a little idea for yourselves. Sex education in school, and was it included in your child's IEP if they had an IEP? And I'm gonna guess that for most of you, you're gonna tell me no, that they didn't receive sex education in school, or they didn't receive sex education that aligned with their needs to be able to learn the content of the information. So most individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities are not provided sex education in schools until high school. And I'm not sure if you know, but most typically developing children receive this by 5th grade or the age of 10. So our children are already 4 or 5 years behind their peers in learning information about sex ed. And then in addition to that, oftentimes what we find is they don't get sex ed until they've actually engaged in something that's inappropriate, or done something where somebody feels like now we should be stepping in. And it's kind of behind the 8 ball here, right? We're trying to catch up on something that should have been done a long time ago. Or in addition to that, they're in a program where the material is presented as if it were in the general ed setting, without the modifications that might be needed for your child to really absorb the information and understand what's happening. And so we have a push. We hope that we can someday make this happen. But in your IEPs or your ISPs, and when you're developing things, there are often little prompts for areas of focus. So there's a behavioral area, an academic area, all of these areas. There's not one for sexuality. And we really do hope sometime, there's a transition one, that at some point we will include sexual education. And so that it will become at least part of the topic at the table for people to talk about, and what should be included when we talk about it. And one of the scariest things, in order to protect some of the individuals that we live or work with, is just this whole internet connection. And my goodness, is it a challenge, right? So the internet is a link to the outside world and almost becomes a substitute friend. And what this really is talking about is those of us who have unfortunately, I guess I call everybody children, right? Because they're my kids too. But we have individuals who maybe go to work, or maybe go to school, or maybe go to a day program. But as soon as they come home, the one thing that they access is their computer. They've got their tablet. They spend a lot of time on it. It's even a device that they're often very proficient at using. And we're maybe even surprised that, they didn't learn how to do something else that seems simple, but boy, could they navigate this whole web and a keyboard. And the problem is, it becomes sort of a substitute friend, because they don't have the social engagement outside of the home or whatever their day program looks like. So in regards to sexual experiences, the internet will be the adolescent's guide and pornography the tutor. And we are finding that individuals are accessing pornographic material on the web. It's certainly age appropriate if the person is over the age of 21, but that's not always the case. We're often finding that individuals are accessing pornography at a much younger age. And then the challenge is telling someone after they've accessed it that this isn't really something that they should watch. So they're getting an inappropriate idea or representation of what relationships are about. They're not understanding, the pornography, way to describe women, or the pornographic way to describe women. They're really getting a misrepresentation, but they are feeling as if it's accurate, or if it's true, and that these things really do happen, where it's okay to approach somebody that you just met within 3 minutes and ask them, to engage in sexual activities with you. And that's one of the ways that people are really getting in trouble. It's not okay. It's not appropriate. But now somebody's accessed this, they've enjoyed watching it, they've become aroused by it. And now you want to tell them that they shouldn't watch it. They shouldn't access it, and they shouldn't want to look at it. And that's really tough, because when I was looking at it, I was enjoying it. So what do you mean it's not appropriate? And here it is, so readily available, and not something that takes much to access anymore. And you can get a whole lot of information off the internet really quickly. So how can it be illegal? And that's a big challenge that we have for many of our individuals. So I will, of course, always recommend that people, if you need to, when your children are younger, to put on some of these protections, parent, things. Somehow our children always seem to be able to get past them, but to use some of those monitors in order to stop our children from even accessing it to begin with. And then outside of that, really having that conversation about the fact that this is not true life. We have to understand the difference between fantasy and reality if it is something that someone who is of age is accessing. So what are some of those things to teach? I get a lot of public versus private. I get a lot of people who tell me, well, I teach my child when they want to masturbate that they need to go in private and do that, or they need to say that they want private time. And that's fine if your child understands the difference between public versus private, right? So you will see a lot of signs out there that say this is private property. Does that mean that this is an okay place to engage in masturbation? No, obviously not. But that word private can be very general to a lot of different things. And so we've got to be careful that we're saying something very specific. And so for some individuals, we have to use more clear, less abstract language. And that would be to say a place and a who. Where can they do it, and who can they do it with, right? So you can do it in your bedroom by yourself. You can do it in your bedroom with a partner if you have a partner, but where can you do it and with who? And that would be a better way to teach something versus to teach public versus private. And those language like that, public versus private, is just a way, again, for us to kind of avoid the really difficult conversation. If your child is sitting in your living room with their hands in their pants and they're engaging in masturbation, sometimes you have to be really specific, as opposed to just saying, if you're going to do that, go to your room. It's like, if I'm going to do what, right? So we have this implied kind of secretive language that we know what we meant, but you have to sometimes say, if you're going to put your hands on your penis, you need to be in your bedroom, and really be very specific about the language that you're using in order to teach that. So there are behaviors that are closed door behaviors and behaviors that are open door behaviors. And one reason that we like to use this language as well is that some of our individuals will, be able to live in less restrictive environments where they're not sharing all of their spaces. And if they have a living room, wherever, they're allowed to do whatever they want, as long as doors are closed, right? As long as the door to the main hallways are closed, if they live in some sort of assisted living place. So it's easier to teach somebody what closed door behaviors are versus open door behaviors. And even for individuals who have more limited language, we can use pictures to explain, naked bodies are behind closed doors. And this is, and closed bodies can be anywhere or when doors are open. And you can do this simply by using visuals to help the child to explain that. Wearing clothes or where they disrobe, all of these things need to be understood under this closed door or open door behaviors, and can change depending on where they live and who they live with. But they certainly need to understand what are appropriate behaviors in shared spaces, and knowing where things have to happen and the boundaries of other people. But I want to be really careful when we talk about privacy of others and boundaries of others. We often put the onus on the person with the intellectual and developmental disability to think about the other person and how invading their space makes them feel. And so there's a lot of our individuals have to really be worried about other people all of the time, and how they feel and how everybody looks at them. And it comes, if you think about it, much of what they're taught is always about how the rest of the world perceives them. And I really want us to turn this around and to look at it in a different way. How can I protect my children is to teach them that their boundary and personal space is really important so that they are safe and that other people don't invade them, right? So you should have space between you and someone else to keep you safe. It's not always about these other people. And I think we just put too much onus on, they really need to worry about what everybody else thinks. And it's opposed to really making this about them and looking at them and saying, this is your body. In order to protect your body, you should always have a distance from other people. You should engage in handshaking versus hugging. These are all things that will protect you. This isn't about other people. So sadly enough, individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities are often exposed to abuse and become victims of sexual assault. And we do know often too that they will remain in inappropriate or relationships because they do lack social relationships. They've been isolated for so long, and they may stay in these relationships because they're just not sure if they'll ever find another one again, or they believe if somebody is on the internet telling them all the things that they're going to make happen for them, they just don't have the understanding that this isn't appropriate. But again, fear, there's a lot of fear that they'll never find another person that will care for them. And I think that's the message that they've heard quite a bit in their lives, that they won't find love. And so when they do, they will hang on to it at all cost. And even if that means being in a relationship that's not healthy. And so we really have to be sure that we're showing individuals what a good positive relationship is, if that's something that they are capable of being in, right? And then what are some of the things that they should not be witnessing. So reasons why they become victims, certainly they are naive, if not been given the education at a level that they could understand it. Some of our children can't tell anyone. They don't have the language to be able to do it. Or even if they can, they often don't report the abuse. So one of the saddest things for me, as I've done my research in the area of females with autism and limited language, is learning about some of the statistics for them and finding out that 68% of girls with autism spectrum disorder will be sexually assaulted before the age of 18. And not to leave this out, but 30% of our males, all very high numbers for sexual assault. And we really need for us to start working adamantly about changing these numbers and helping to teach our children how to stay safe in outside of here. And then the other challenge we have also is that some of our individuals will also become offenders, right? And not for all the same reasons. I don't want to discount this. There are some individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities who will engage in inappropriate sexual behaviors for reasons, outside of their disability. But there are many that because of their disability, they either were not taught, they don't have the social understanding of how to achieve a good relationship. So they do things that are highly inappropriate. They haven't been taught the emotions of other people, or, empathy or inferencing, or really kind of perspective taking, and how to put themselves in the shoes of other people. And we really need to be teaching that. Sometimes some of our offenders have been associated with individuals who are much younger than them. They engage in relationships that are inappropriate with younger people. And so then they get in trouble. But that gets back to what we were talking about before, not really understanding the age consent, not understanding what they were doing was not consensual. So there's a lot of different areas where individuals can become offenders and then get into our criminal justice system. And that's just a terrible place, for them to be, of course. But it's also, the resources there are even less for our children. And some of the behaviors that they may engage in, when we look at some of the disability, the stalking, or becoming sort of obsessed with a single person, is kind of in line with some of that, from the autism spectrum side, that perseverating on one thing. Harassment can become an issue because, of course, they may not know how to respond to somebody who rejects them. And then predominantly, a lot of offenders, it is due to this inappropriate sexual behavior and not really just understanding the social norms of where things are permitted to happen, right? So inappropriate as in public masturbation, inappropriate as in going up to people and asking them things that they're not supposed to, or touching people in the malls and other places. So that's been a big challenge of teaching individuals what they can and cannot do. And we as family members also need to explain how to not tolerate allowing things to happen because they have a disability. And I do think that that sometimes happens. I'll take ownership of that, even on my own side. Do we allow people to, hug or get closer to our children, or allow our children to do that maybe when they should be beyond that by now, or limited? So things we have to be teaching, recognizing abusive or unsafe relationships, understanding the boundaries, theirs and others, and then teaching who can be in different environments with you, who's allowed to be in the bathroom with you, who's allowed to be in the bedroom with you, who can touch you, who can you touch. When I started with one part of my research was on females in the gynecologist's office. I had a gynecologist who was horrific experience, but they said that they wouldn't give Alana a breast exam. They wanted to teach me how to do it. And I just had to say, how inappropriate is that? What other mother is asked to engage in this behavior with their child? I need to teach my child that that examination only happens under these conditions when these people are present. And we can do that with the use of some, visual cues for them. And to really say it doesn't happen anywhere else. And to just say that someone's mom can do it is really sort of a disservice to our children entirely. But we can teach this, whether we teach this via visuals, whether it's conversation or utilizing some curriculum, we can teach this regardless of where someone falls in that language ability. And then safety, as I said before, sometimes we have a tendency to allow our children maybe to get away with a couple of things that we wouldn't if they were typical. And I have to remind people that what was once cute at 5 is no longer cute at 15 and will get you arrested at 25, right? So autism or other, developmental disabilities does not allow you to get away with doing things that aren't appropriate. And in general, one story always comes up when I talk about this, and it was about a mom who had a young boy at 9 who liked to touch women's legs. And she really didn't see the problem with the fact that he was touching strange women's legs. And when somebody would get upset about it and tell her to tell her son to stop, she would just use the excuse of, well, he has autism. And so we really need to expect more out of our children, and we can't expect that much out of, sort of society and people, because that's really setting our children up. If we allow that, and if a stranger actually was like, sure, that's fine, is that not then opening up our children to further exposure, right? One of the things that we really stress is that bathrooming, and focusing on that when our children are young, and ensuring that they become, fully trained within the bathroom. Because if you always have a child who needs other people to care for them in their genital areas, you're always going to be exposing a child to the possibility of some sort of abuse or vulnerability. So in this study, they really sort of summed up, right, that individuals with autism are not generally involved in peer groups. They're excluded from valuable learning opportunities that shape people's sexual behaviors. And why this is important is because I think all of you could probably say to me that your mom and dad, my dad's version of sex ed was just say no, right? But your mom and dad probably or may have explained something to you about sex. But really, who truly shaped your sexual behaviors is more than likely your peers, your other friends, other people that you were involved with. Rarely is it our parents who shaped our sexual behavior. And what we know about individuals, with intellectual and developmental disabilities is they don't have these peer groups or these friends to be able to develop these relationships with in order to be able to have those conversations that you may have had with, one of your girlfriends or guy friends when you first engaged in sexual activity and, talked about it. And, all of that, you didn't get to they don't get to have that experience. So what happens true is not only do they not have all of the information about what it means to be a sexual being during their teenage years, but much of what they do learn comes from this very sort of stoic language that their parents use because we want to present everything in a very clinical way. And then when they use clinical language to explain things, it comes off as lacking passion, and it comes off as lacking desire because they're using clinical language. But remember, they're only using that because the people who taught them about sex ed were all these other adults in their lives. And they don't, that doesn't mean that they lack any less passion for wanting a relationship or any less passion for wanting to be a sexual being. So who should be teaching them? Of course, parents were given the job of this, right? But parents are often saying, wait a minute, hold up, I'm afraid to start. And then teachers were always saying that this is beyond their scope. And for us parents, I think the challenge really is this, right? I don't want to hear about my typically developing daughter's sex life. How much more difficult is this for me with my child with disabilities? And because I have the hurdles of trying to find the materials that I may need in order to be successful to do this, but we're the ones that are given the job, to maybe make this happen or to help to make it happen. And then in some of our, as you're getting older now and you're talking about residential placements and some other things or having ISPs, we really do need to start having those questions. Are there sexual preferences that we're helping to support someone to be able to, express themselves? Are there sexual behaviors and they need help in doing that? Is there a need for successful masturbation or a need for successful relationships, depending on which one that they will be utilizing? So too often we think that masturbation is just a natural thing that all people learn how to do. And that's absolutely not the case. Unfortunately, many of the individuals that I work with engage in inappropriate masturbation techniques, which can cause damage to their genitals. And it's not just automatic or that's something that they know how to do. And if we're not helpful in doing that, we have a lot of sexual frustration, and we need to really be showing or teaching them, right? And I'm not asking anybody to show exactly, but there are visuals that are available out there. There are picture schedules that are available out there. There are many things that we could utilize, just like they learned how to wash their hands, in order to teach them how to engage in other masturbatory acts, or if it's something about relationships, we're really talking about getting more involved in social skills training and how we would be able to help them with that. So here's some things that you can, download for free. We love free. Sexuality Across the Lifespan is a sex ed curriculum that's available as a PDF. You can download it. It's a great starting point for some folks and it'll give you some information. It was specifically developed for those with developmental disabilities. It's short, it's limited, but it is a good place to start and to give you some information about how to start working or teaching your child about, sexuality. And before, if anybody's going to teach this, whether in a day program or in another environment outside of the home, we really have to discuss this with the family first if they are guardians of the individuals, and what are their concerns about teaching it, what are their concerns about having this language out there and really kind of helping their child to understand it. What are the parental protections that might have to be put on the computers? And we talk about parental protections, they may need to be needed later if you have if they're allowed to in other environments, right? Not accepting any inappropriate behaviors as part of this, the disability. And then when I say not using the bedroom for timeout, regardless of age, I do know that even in some of our residential placements, people go to their rooms to kind of get into their neutral corners. We have to look at the bedroom as not being a place of punishment, so that when you do want to send someone there and say, look, if you want to, as we said before, if you want want to touch your penis, you need to go in your bedroom, that it's not the same as a timeout for any other reason, because we don't want this to be a shameful activity, right? And then the other one that I often hear when somebody has their hands in their pants is quiet hands. I really have a hard time with this one. You know, and the reason that I say that is once I take my hands out of my pants, what are you going to do and help me to do to stay engaged and active? I have found that most individuals engage in masturbatory, acts out in public, usually when they're bored and not engaged. So I'll take my hands out of my pants, but now what? Now what are we going to do, and how are we going to keep me occupied, right? So we as behavior analysts, when we get called in for things like that, I have to say to people, I don't behavior out boredom. You've got to make an environment enriched and engaging in order to keep somebody from going into these types of behaviors. So instead of suppressing masturbation, which can lead to increased frustration, techniques to support appropriate masturbation can be taught, provided that such techniques are legally allowed, ethically appropriate, and intended to improve the quality of life. So we can teach individuals how to masturbate appropriately without having to touch them and to be in the room with them and to physically engage with them. It does take time. It does take consistency, like everything else that was taught, but we can use visual supports for this. We can use devices in order to show them how to use something that might allow them to not have to use their hands as much and maybe able to support them that way. But we would have to make this very specific to the individual and able to help them with this. So how do we usually teach how to stop the inappropriate sexual behaviors? Is we have to differentially reinforce, big terminology, but we have to reinforce the appropriate behavior. When they do engage in something that is appropriate, when they do utilize masturbation behind closed doors, that should be, reinforcing enough for them. But some of our individuals may need more, and we have to not overreact when we find things happening in another environment, because some individuals may actually enjoy that overreaction to it. And I have been in schools where people get, really upset. Get your hands out of that's disgusting. They get into this whole, and that alone can be something that somebody finds funny, somebody finds reinforcing, they may want to do it again. So they know that the person is going to react, they may keep doing it. So we have to learn to just not and really reinforce when they choose that private area to go to. Right, so we can look into, again, some ABA strategies from people like myself and how we may be able to teach more appropriate settings using visuals for both the act of masturbation and where this is appropriate. We can also utilize something called social stories, where we can develop these social story formats to teach individuals about the social interactions. And these have been developed in the past for dating social interactions, for masturbatory behaviors, as well as teaching females about their menstrual cycle. So all of these can be developed. And right now, some of them can even be purchased, I believe, and downloaded from one of the, I could get that resource for you, but from a company that's starting to write these out for individuals in all different levels, about dating, about having sex, but also about staying safe. And then those for who are more advanced, social mapping can really be a great way to look at, if you engage in these appropriate behaviors, this is what could happen. And if you engage in these inappropriate behaviors, this is what could happen, but really kind of explaining what the consequences are to appropriate or inappropriate behaviors. So if you have someone who's interested in sexual activity or in dating or relationships and all, this is a book called Making Sense of Sex. And I found this particular sort of timeline really a great tool for many of our individuals that we work with, because it gives that visual representation of what it is that we may be trying to describe to them about relationships. And so here, I don't know if my cursor is showing up, here it just talks about that classic sort of, you meet somebody, usually usually you kind of go out with a bunch of other people, you're hanging out in this group, you're just kind of sharing some information and looks. And then next thing you know, maybe you want to, go somewhere together, go out on a date, and it kind of moves it along. The positive about this is we can extend this timeline to whatever we would want. We could add as many different things as we think we would need to add, for the family's own preferences of what goes on. But I just think showing it really kind of shows us, kind of what it looks like to engage in a relationship and how a relationship moves in order to show someone kind of where they might be. Because if somebody they meet wants to jump all the way to the end right away, then we can explain, right, that may not be the path that they should be on, unless this is a sort of consensual interaction. And then some of the challenges that we do have with all of that when we're talking about how we can help. So some individuals on the autism spectrum who have more verbal language and in more inclusive settings really still struggled with this idea of sexuality and what was appropriate and what wasn't appropriate. And so they were shown sort of these scenarios of different things, and they could clearly point out things that were labeled as black flags, that this was inappropriate. But they had a hard time with ones that would be considered a yellow flag and understanding why that was inappropriate. And what we've got to kind of look at is, why would they not understand this? And I'm going to get back to sex ed, understanding the laws, understanding, our cultural norms. I think what people tend to forget is all of these things about sex and being attracted to people and all of that have been sort of set in our cultural norms. And children who aren't included with their peers often don't get the lessons taught to them about what those sexual norms are. And that is usually, individuals that we work with, they don't have that. So another resource for you that I highly recommend is this one called Safe. And I believe the PowerPoint will be available, but my email is at the end if anybody wants the links to these or whatever. But this is really one about teaching individuals and supporting them about their staying safe, right? How to be ready out in the work environment, how to be ready out in the community, and how to understand the differences between, good relationships, bad relationships, and what to expect, how to be safe, and empower them. I think that's probably the key word that we're all looking for now, is how do we empower them and not just try to corral them to the point where we have kept them so safe, right? That it's impossible to maintain because they're going to be exposed to other people. And that's a great bubble to live in if the bubble can never get popped, but that's just not possible because, as we know, everybody eventually has to not be visually in front of you, or you're not going to be able to keep them safe all the time. And this is really about giving them those tools to help them to understand and to recognize, when somebody is not treating them the way that they should be treated. Another one available is another curriculum that can be completely downloaded off of the internet for agencies or schools that might want to develop a program in order to start teaching about sexual health. This one is available as well, and this comes with PowerPoint presentations and visuals, and even some assessment of where the child falls now, so that you can gear the language that you're going to use and where you're going to start in this to help them. And here's a PDF that I will again make available to all of you that has a laundry list of resources that are available to help you to navigate and finding materials that will help you to present any of this information to your loved one or your families. So look, if the child is unable to ask and they have very limited language, I get this often when I present, how do I know if my child's ready for sexuality, or if my child's ready for masturbation? And of course, just because someone's hands are in their pants doesn't mean they're masturbating. It just feels good, it's comforting, toddlers do it. So that's not necessarily a time to say, oh, we better jump on teaching about masturbation right now. But you really do need to look for those signs of interest. You need to know whether, for some of our males, whether they've had, wet dreams or nocturnal ejaculations yet, because you can't do something until all of the body parts are actually working, and in order to do that. So we have to ensure that all their inappropriate behaviors are addressed and discuss with the family the need for teaching alternatives if we have to. I certainly say that we have to respect all of our family's values when it comes to what they want their child to do or don't want their child to do, and especially if they have guardianship. The challenge really comes for me when someone doesn't want someone to engage in masturbatory behaviors, because that generally leads to a lot of frustration and maybe behaviors that come out in another way, right? So these inappropriate behaviors will then come out in aggression or come out in some other way. So although I understand the values of some, that they don't want them to do this, whether for religious or other cultural reasons, the challenge that we do have is imposing some of those on individuals who won't have an alternative access, right? So if you were to say to me that there was definitely going to be an opportunity for a relationship in the future, I could understand that. But some of our children, we do have to understand that won't happen. And how can we help them to not be frustrated? Because their bodies are going to respond sexually. All of our bodies do. So the gaps in the development and the knowledge appropriate for expression may lead to these inappropriate sexual behaviors. So again, if we don't teach them what needs to be done, or if we don't teach them how, they're going to eventually engage in some sort of inappropriate sexual behavior, or even just get their that frustration out in a way that looks to be somebody might want to write up a behavior intervention plan because it looks to be, as it's titled, aggression. But we have found that some individuals look to become aggressive in order to get kind of that same physical interaction from another person. So most sexuality education programs and curriculum are developed for children and adults with autism have not been evaluated, and that is true. However, it fails to examine, most of them it failed to examine sort of the nuances about individuals with developmental disabilities, and we've got to look at that. And almost all of it focuses really on males and not on our females or our women. And that one about SAFE is really a great one. There used to be one called Escape Now, and I've not been able to locate it again. I'm not sure what happened, but that one also was about sort of protecting and empowering individuals out in the community. And if I find that, I will certainly forward that. But we don't have enough resources yet. And so what that means for most of us who want to teach is that we've got to modify what's out there or available to others. And in future planning, when you're looking at individuals, moving out of your home, possibly into some either group home, residential, assisted living, if you're having ISP meetings, you've really got to look at the rules of the organization. I do know that there have been some organizations that are supported by religious organizations, and they don't allow pornography to come into the home. If pornography is the way that someone is successful in their masturbation, and they get moved into a residential placement where pornography is not allowed, a Playboy magazine or anything, then they may either one, break the rules and get kicked out, or two, become very frustrated. And then again, looking at the opinions of the staff, and I am surprised often that the number of people in a bedroom when they're adults, that they still sleep multiple people to a room in some places. So when you're planning for the future of your child, really looking at where will they live, and if you know that they're a sexual being and that they need this time, do you want to make sure you have all of these questions answered as well when you're picking that environment that you want to move them into? Because just picking a spot, you might find out later that they don't allow certain things, or, just the opinions of the staff alone can be embarrassing for individuals if they're not supported in that environment. Okay. And I'm just going to go right ahead and say, if we have any questions, let's go there.
Bobby, thank you so much.
Sure.
Always a pleasure hearing you present. One of
Thank
my
you.
favorites. We do actually have quite a few questions coming in.
Okay.
The first question is actually coming from a family member that wants to know, how modified can a sex ed curriculum be? I think that there is some hesitation that the individual that they're teaching would be able to comprehend the information that is
Okay.
trying to be.
So I think one would be, what information are we trying to teach? Are we trying to teach that public versus private thing, or are we trying to teach about body parts? But we can modify a curriculum down to the simplest of matching pictures to discuss what needs to happen. So, I work with individuals who have no language and utilize, a PEC system in order to speak, and then individuals who, could probably give talks, right? And give this presentation. So, but we can modify the curriculum for a sex ed. And what I really think people need to understand, if we could do some of the assessments for some of our children, is where we start is not, let's start labeling your body parts that are your genitals, right? Where we start may be eyes and mouth and ears and nose, and maybe they have that, but then the next thing is, what are bodily fluids? Do they even know about blood and saliva? So we're not going right to penises, vaginas, and semen. We've got to, and that helps the families as well, right? We're going to bring this in slowly, but we've got to know and assess where they are in so many other areas before we go right to kind of this topic. But it's still a part of sexuality. And that's what I think people are afraid of it, but they don't realize how much baseline information we've kind of bring into it.
Sure. Can you talk a little bit about the visuals that might be used? So if you're using a social story, and again, I know that a lot of this really is going to have the input of a family's consent and so on. But can you talk a little bit about the visuals used when teaching? I think a lot of the resources that we've seen in the past for my son were more cartoon-like visuals, where I felt it wasn't necessarily relatable. Can you talk a little bit about your feelings on that?
Sure. So we can develop very specific visuals for an individual to be able to utilize. And we may use, so I mentioned the use of devices, and we have used my son has used a device for years that we found was effective for him. But we can take the device and we can take store-bought, penis, replications or dildos, however you want to kind of word it, right? And we can make videos showing the usage of the device with this. We can take it in pictures, we can do it in videos, and we can make it very specific to the child so that it looks as realistic as possible, because that's one of the things we want to do without sort of violating and touching anybody. There's enough things out there available to us now where we can access those and make these pictures or videos to show them that the penis has to go in this device, right? Or that the lube has to go on the penis first. And if the child can watch a video, great. If they need static pictures, we can do it that way. So there's a lot. I think it's just a matter of getting the help with your team of who's comfortable, kind of doing that, making those. And it would be about really deciding which device is the right thing to use, or if we're going to use hands. Again, we can do all of this with models.
I have a parent asking how they can introduce a sex ed curriculum to their child's class. Any suggestions of how they can approach a child study team who is giving some pushback in regards to this?
I don't like to hear pushback. So, well, I think there's a book. Oh goodness, the author's name is Davida Hartman. It's Davida, so David with an A, Davida Hartman, and she has a book. In the beginning of the book, there's an assessment of the class or the program and what they do, and then there's an assessment of each child that they would have. And I think just like we said before, if you could introduce to the school, some of the beginning things that you're supposed to be working on are health related, our children. The other challenge or thing that I want to say is we know that our children are entitled to sex education because we, in this state, if they're in the state of New Jersey and they're listening in from there, this is a mandatory sex ed state and you have to opt out. And the only people that it's not mandatory for are children who have special needs and have an IEP. And it's only not mandatory because nobody brings it up, but it is still a mandatory state. And so she's doing the right thing by bringing it up. They have no right to push back, right? Because we're a mandatory sex ed state. And so I would use that language to really express that to the child study team. And we can find the core standards that align with that in order to say my child should be learning, right? There's a lot of push for core standards to align for academics. And, and here we have our children learning things that maybe not even be appropriate for them, but they had to do it because teachers were told they had to, but now they're flipping that when it comes to sex ed, right? And they really can't. You've got to still stick with it. If it has to meet the core standards, then they need to be addressing it there. But I think if the teachers saw the core standards that relate to sexual health, maybe they'd be a little less frightened by it. I think a lot of us, as an educator and as a mom, even, I don't want somebody showing my child pictures of, genitals and like they would say, touch dog, be like, touch penis. That's not language that we want to use. And I think that's where teachers are afraid. They just don't know what they're supposed to be teaching. But if they use those assessment tools, I think they'd have a better idea.
We had someone who had asked prior to the session that I guess one of their concerns was that their child really repeats, mimics others' words, and then it sort of goes on repeat. So they were afraid or hesitant to teach the proper terminology for their body parts, afraid that he in public would then just keep repeating that word over and over. Any suggestions on how that may be approached?
Not an uncommon one, right? Not an uncommon one. So the challenge would be, of course, to first address that particular behavior. That's a separate behavior, right? What are things we talk about with other people and what are things that we talk about, right, in public versus private? If we're just talking about repetitive language, that's like echolalia, and they just have that, vocal stereotypy where they just say everything, that's different. Vocal stereotypy would have to be addressed differently. But if we're talking about somebody who, while we're out at TGI Fridays, decides they want to talk to everybody about this sex ed thing their teacher told them about and starts mentioning penises, that in of itself is a different behavior that has to be worked on, to say right now people aren't afraid to talk to him about things, or they're watching what they say around him. Somebody's eventually going to say the word penis, right? So and he's going to say it. We need to start right now to say, what are things that you only say to mom and dad, or what are things that you only say to your caretakers, and what are things that you can say to someone else? That lesson gets taught first, and you can practice it with things that are benign, right? So you can practice it with, you can only talk to mom and dad about, the fact that this lady, Miss Bobby, has red hair. And then if they go out and they tell other people that Miss Bobby has red hair, well, then we know we're not there yet. Right. So you work on it with these benign things first, and then we build off of that. When we know that the child can manage it, that's when we would start to bring in the conversation.
Great suggestion. I think, right, and that's why we're so grateful to have you on this session today. It's not the way that most parents have naturally think, right?
Right.
It's sort of that behind the scenes and thinking a few steps ahead. So like I said, I think this is all really valuable information being shared today.
Right.
Are there additional evidence-based curriculums that you have identified? I know that you shared the one.
Yeah, no, there's none that are evidence-based even the
Okay.
ones that I got to share with you, they're not evidence-based. And that really is kind of a challenge for all of us, right? So there are ones that are out there that certainly align with curriculum that are taught in general ed classes, and there's modifications, but they're not evidence-based. The only one that I knew of that was that Escape Now one that has been taken down. So I'm not sure why or where it went or what happened to it. It used to be available, but it's not now. The only thing that we do know is that we have evidence-based strategies for how to teach things, and that we can break down a curriculum and use those strategies in order to teach. But we don't have one that's been, sort of gone through the process or the peer review.
I want to get to a few more questions if you have the time.
Sure.
Any resources of materials to discuss gynecological visits?
Yes. Oh my goodness. I just sent something to somebody the other day.
So, and if you're
I have to find
comfortable,
it. Yeah, I have to find
that's
it. Go
okay.
ahead.
If you're comfortable, we have a lot of people asking for a copy of the slides.
Yes.
So I will save those as a PDF. I will also forward that along with a recording of today's session. So if you happen to come across that resource, I'll send that email out to everyone who registered at the
Yes.
end of the week, and then I'll include that resource if you
Okay.
come across it.
Okay. It's an Amazon. It's a book on Amazon. It's easy to get for females around gynecology. It has beautiful pictures on how to put on a pad. It has so many things. It's really awesome. And I just sent the link to somebody 2 days ago. I know I could find it if I get into my emails. But so that I will be happy to forward that.
Wonderful. So are there treatments or doctors that you could recommend for adults if you are concerned about their sexual activity and they have already received education and therapy?
Yes. So yes, I mean, it really depends on where you live in the state, right? So there's one organization that is called ASSECT, ASSECT is the acronym, and I believe it's just assect.org, and you can find sex therapists there who will help individuals if you're concerned about where they're going. And then if you're concerned about anybody who's already engaged in inappropriate sexual activity and you're fearful that they will continue, the New Jersey Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers is out there, and they have psychologists on, as members, and those members are people who are used to working with individuals. There are a couple that are also used to working with individuals with intellectual disabilities, but they're used to working with individuals who have been in sometimes even already in the system for inappropriate sexual activity. But the first one would be ASSECT, and to really get a sex therapist or sexual health educator that way, that would be able to directly, a sex counselor who could help. I think maybe the challenge is that often people think about sex therapy as marriage counseling or something, and that's not always it. You can see on their bios if they have, inappropriate sexual behavior as one of their areas of treatment.
And let's get to one more, I guess,
Sure.
before we say our goodbyes.
Okay.
Can you talk a little bit about some avenues that professionals or family members can go through if their loved one lives in a group home and a group home is not supportive in teaching this kind of education? Would you suggest that they go through a BCBA? Is there a certain kind of therapist that they can access to assist in this process?
Wow. So if you're not, there's a challenge, right? So I'm not fully aware of all of the rules and laws when it comes to that. If they have a support coordinator, I would definitely tell them to talk to their support coordinator about what needs to be done in order to help them and who the resources are that they could go to. Not all BCBAs work in the area of sexuality, so it's not just a blanket go to a BCBA person either. That's a challenge. But if they're not supportive at the placement, my understanding, if a parent's not supportive of an individual, I can lose my rights to being their guardian. if I don't allow them to engage in, sexual activity that they want to engage in. So if we're looking at masturbation, or if we're looking at even relationships, I mean, I know two individuals and a adult placement that I consult with who are in a relationship, and they have to be able to support them to go on dates and and to engage in sexual activity together, because they don't live in the same homes, and that has to be allowed and made to happen because they are their own beings. So I guess that would be a matter of like really talking to all of the people, but this is a violation of their rights. I mean, they have the right to be sexual beings, and not being supportive, I guess what I have to say is just not an option. But I don't know who they could go to argue that, other than to say they're being violated, and what would the avenue be for violation anywhere else? I think you would go down the same one.
Sure. I think with the guardian or parent advocate,
Yeah.
and with with that team, the IDT team, and
Yeah.
especially the support coordinator, hopefully being able to provide some additional guidance in that area. That would be
We have to be able to, and even I mean, a lot of the agencies have nurses on staff and other things. We have to be able to talk about sex ed the same way we talk about if they had a feeding issue, if they had to be on a chopped diet, all these other things that everybody is just so easily able to speak about. But when we ask them to talk about sex, it just becomes this huge taboo moment. And that's where I would really say that we need to really be looking at what is available to them for anything else that you would have brought to this table. Those same people should be the ones that are involved in this as well.
Bobby, Dr. Gallagher, thank you again, as always, for being so willing to share this information that so many others find to be too sensitive to talk about. So
absolutely,
it's a needed conversation.
Okay.
To be able to collaborate with you again in the future. This session, I'm seeing my messages just pop up. Has been very well received by everyone involved. Again, the Community Living Education Project, we really try to tailor our presentations around the needs of the community. And I think that this was absolutely a need. So thank you so much. Just for everyone, as we're preparing to sign off, please know that you're going to see a brief survey pop up on your screen. It's information that you share that allows us to tailor our future sessions. So help us help you by contributing. It takes maybe 30 seconds. Dr. Gallagher, thank you again. Greatly appreciated.
Thank you. Take care.
Be well,
Bye-bye.
everyone.